Welcome to session 104 of the Worlds of Speculative Fiction series. For those who are new to this, I'll tell you what it is in just a moment, but I want to get to the books that we're going to be covering in this session. And this is a little bit of a change to the schedule. We were going to do Neil Hancock's 4-book series about the Circle of Light, but those proved to be difficult to get a hold of, and so I made an executive decision to change it to these 4 books, which maybe some of you recognize. We've talked about Jim Butcher's The Dresden Files series in a number of episodes, and since I am currently reading my way through these along with my dad, who I chat with about it, I figured why not sub that in. So we are going to be looking at books 13 through 16, beginning with Ghost Story, then Cold Days, then Skin Game, and then finally the much shorter Peace Talks. So another 4-book series. Now, for anybody who's new to this, what is Worlds of Speculative Fiction? Well, it's an ongoing series now in its 11th year where we do exactly that. We look at narrative universes spanning novels or short stories by a particular author, sometimes multiple authors, and we look at the world building that's involved, at some of the key narrative, but also philosophical themes. So we might be going into ethics, into metaphysics, into epistemology, philosophy of technology, all sorts of other things. And with the Dresden Files, we've got a lot to focus on. What are these? Well, they're often called urban fantasy. Another way to think about the Dresden Files is the supernatural world is real, and there's a central character who's a wizard, Harry Dresden, who lives in Chicago, at least some of the time, and the story constellates around that and gets larger and larger and larger. So there's a lot for us to cover in these particular books. What we do, or what we did originally, was meet in a local library. I would video record the conversation that we had. I would do a presentation. People would ask questions, bring up whatever they wanted. Then with COVID, we wound up going online after not having any sessions for a while, and that's what we're doing now. I produce a 90 to 120 minute video working through the books that we are checking out at the time, talking about world building, philosophical themes, sometimes looking at what the author, him or herself, has to say about their own work, which we'll be doing in this one. And then during the video premiere, I'm there for live chat so people can put whatever they want, more or less relevant, into the chat, and I'll respond to them. And then afterwards, we follow it up with a video conferencing session on Zoom to take the conversation a little bit deeper and further. Now, if you're just coming to this later on, feel free to leave comments. I'll always check them out and usually reply to them. And, that's essentially what the series is. Every year we've set out like a list of who we're covering, and so that is what Worlds of Speculative Fiction is all about. So these books are part of an ongoing series. Butcher is still writing them. We're still reading them. We've done a number of sessions on them in the past. Typically, Butcher writes the books in 4-book sequences, which provide a decent break point And it's about, it may look a little intimidating, the amount of material here, but they're actually fairly quick reads. So, it's not a ton of stuff. If you haven't read these novels already, I would not suggest immediately beginning with book 13, but starting at the beginning. But if you've been reading along with the Dresden Files, well, there is a lot that is happening in these. So we're going to jump right into talking about the world that Dresden is inhabiting and acting within, that Butcher is sketching out for us, and then we'll jump into plot, character, action, philosophical themes, and setting. It strikes me that some people might be coming to this rather cold, not knowing an awful lot about the world of the Dresden Files, so we should do some preliminary sketching of the setting of this entire series, which is progressively revealed to us book after book after book. Now, Butcher himself has said that he actually has a long plan for how the books are connected with each other and what gets brought out or focused on in each book. He's had to revise that, as we've seen looking at interviews, going from, I think, originally an 18-book sequence to a somewhat longer sequence, but he's making good progress on it. So with books 13 through 16, we're pretty far along in the series. There's a lot that we can tell you about it, and there are going to be some spoilers. Now, I do want to say this about spoilers. A lot of people like to avoid them. It's pretty inevitable that you're going to encounter them in talking about a series like this because of the important development that's been taking place. But spoilers don't need to ruin things for you when you've got really good writing. Knowing what's coming next does not necessarily take away your joy in reading or the experience that you have of saying, whoa, that's crazy, look what's happening here, or having a sense of awe and wonder. So spoilers ahead, just fair warning about that. So I mentioned this is happening largely in or around Chicago. Now, granted, there are many other domains. They're going to go into the realm of fairy at a number of points, and that's pretty extensive. They'll go to other places as well, including in Skin Game, the realm of Hades himself. So there's a lot of locations, but most of the action is actually happening in the city of Chicago. Why? Well, because that's where Harry Dresden is located. He begins the series as a wizard who's also a private eye, and he, retains that status, although he's doing a lot more wizarding and other things by the time that we're looking at these books. So he has connections with the Chicago Police Department through another one of the main characters, Karen Murphy, who he starts out just being a colleague with. By the time that we're deep into these books, they will finally be able to recognize, live out their attraction to each other. The stars will align, at least for a little while. But Dresden is somebody who makes his living as a wizard, dealing with supernatural matters. Why is that important in Chicago? Because as it turns out, Chicago is at kind of a confluence of a lot of different forces. Even more so, an island that we'll talk about shortly, Demon Watch, which is north and east of Chicago in Lake Michigan, a convergence of a whole bunch of different ley lines. So Harry Dresden is going to encounter things like trolls and ghouls and other kinds of monsters while he's on the job, and so are some of the police. There's Murphy at the beginning of the series is in charge of the special division, which takes these supernatural cases that the rest of the police department doesn't want to know about, actually doesn't know about, because most human beings don't recognize the supernatural when they encounter it, in part because it's scary, and in part because it doesn't fit into our modern way of understanding things. But it turns out there's many, many human beings as well as other creatures throughout the city, and this is the case in other cities as well. So, what kind of supernatural beings are we talking about? Well, there's ghouls, which Harry really doesn't like at all, and they tend to be pretty evil. There are a variety of different fairy folk, some of whom he actually is connected with, providing them with pizza, little tiny fairies who help him out gathering information and occasionally protecting him. There's, among fairy, two big divisions. There's summer and winter, and each of them has a knight. Harry will eventually, by the time that he's in these books, become the Knight of Winter, which he chose to do in order to protect his daughter after having broken his back. He contracts with Mab, the Lady of Winter, in order to do so. And you don't really want to be in debt to Mab. But there's summer, and there's different levels of the different ladies involved in it. And then there's winter, and summer is all about, growth and fertility and things like that. Winter is about what you might imagine, the, effects of winter, but also lust and fighting and things along those lines. And they're in a clash with each other. As a matter of fact, they were in a significant war earlier in the series. So those are some important fairy forces. And then there's also what we might call unaligned fairy folks as well, like the Earl King, who Harry has encountered before in the past, and who's also going to show up in Cold Days as well. And others that aren't quite fitting into that. So there's this entire realm of the Siddha, the Fae, the fairies that are involved. And you can go from this world to that world by crossing over in certain places. As it turns out, too, Harry has a fairy godmother, the Siddha. So there's all of that. And then another really major group are the various kinds of vampires. Now, there have been some big changes by the time that we get to these books, but books 1 through 12, there are really three main types of vampires that are playing really important plot point roles. There is a fourth one, but they are over in East Asia, the Jade Court, so we know about them, but they don't enter into the story. So there are Black Court, Red Court, and White Court vampires. White Court vampires are those who feed off of various emotions. The one that Harry has the closest connection, feed off of lust, the wraiths, R-A-T-I-H, not wraith as in the other sense. And Harry is actually a half-brother with one of the White Court vampires. So he's got a complicated relationship with them. Others feed off of fear or off of despair. And then we have the Red Court vampires. The Red Court vampires are the scary ones who suck blood and, turn people into their slaves. And they've actually been a major antagonist throughout the entire thing. However, at the end of the 12th book, so before all of these other books, through some interesting machinations, Harry has managed to pull off the reversal of a spell that was supposed to kill him and everybody he's related to, which includes his grandfather, Ebenezer the Blackstaff, member of the White Council, who we'll talk about shortly. And he gets it to kill, through killing his the mother of his child, Susan, who was his lover, who's been turned into a Red Court vampire. He kills all of the Red Court, leaving a massive power vacuum that's going to play a big plot point in this. Then we have the Black Court. And the Black Court are the ones that Bram Stoker wrote about. As a matter of fact, we find out earlier in the series that Bram Stoker was commissioned by the White Court basically to write a how to kill vampires manual. They are much more bestial than either the White or the Red, much more dangerous individually. And, they have been kind of curbed, but they're still out there as well. There are werewolves of different sorts. Harry's actually friends with some of the ones in Chicago. By the way, the White Court has some of their offices in the Chicagoland area, as did the Red Court. So now we've got quite a few different kinds of monsters, right, playing around. We also have ghosts, we have specters, we have all sorts of eldritch beings that you can run into. There are necromancers who play important roles. And we're going to find out as well that there are other beings called the Outsiders. And they are sort of, if you think about like H.P. Lovecraft's depiction of the elder, gods and old ones and stuff like that, kind of beyond our comprehension, and nonetheless trying to get into this dimension. And as it turns out, we're going to find out there's a war going on holding them in check, but some of them show up every once in a while as well in the story. And when they do, they're pretty terrifying and pretty difficult. There's other beings as well, skinwalkers, the Naglioshi. As it turns out, there's not just a few of them, but quite a few of them around. Very old beings that go all the way back to perhaps the beginning of the world. The people of the forest, like the Sasquatches, Grendel types as well. And we find out that there's all sorts of other beings that are quasi-human, or at least connected with them. Odin exists and has Valkyries. People can go to Valhalla. There's a Valkyrie who actually works for a mob boss, John Marcone, who we'll come back to in a moment. Harry is a wizard. And the wizards have been around for a long time as well. They are effectively governed by, I won't say effectively because there's problems with it, but they are in effect governed by a white council, which includes higher members, wardens, of which Harry is one by this point in time, and a whole bunch of other members of the council. They follow the laws of magic, which if you violate, you are considered a warlock. Don't mess with the outer gates. Don't use magic to take over somebody else's mind. Don't use magic to murder. And as it turns out, Harry did that with the man who originally brought him up, to whom he was an apprentice, a very evil man. And so he was under the, sword of Damocles of one of the wardens just waiting to kill him if he got out of line, while he was apprenticed then to Ebenezer, who turned out to be his grandfather. Ebenezer is the one guy, the Blackstaff, who can violate the laws of magic. He's sort of like the hitman. He does the wet work, as Harry describes it. And there's more to the story yet. They come to suspect that there is some sort of big plot going on within the White Council, but also other organizations as well, which Harry and Ebenezer call the Black Council, and they actually previously organized a Gray Council within it. So it's getting quite complicated, isn't it? So you've got all of these different groups that are kind of competing with each other. And I mentioned John Marcone. He is a mobster in Chicago who shows up very, very early on in the series. He and Harry have a lot of interactions, as does Karen Murphy, and he ends up becoming the first human baron in Chicago, completely human, no magic whatsoever, to sign the Unseelie Accords. Now you might say, well, what the hell is that? So Mab, the Queen of Air and Darkness, the Lady of Winter, has forced onto all of these different parties, the various vampire courts, except for the black, the fairies, other entities like the White Council, a set of agreements governing how they can interact with each other. It doesn't mean they can't fight, but they have to fight in certain regulated ways. And John Marcone gets brought in and becomes his own power, his own entity, right? Governed by these accords. I have to mention as well, so we've got all these cool elements of vampires and werewolves and wizards and, skinwalkers and, various humanoid things and the fairies. Well, there's other things going on as well. There's the diabolical and the heavenly. There are angels in this. There are knights of the swords, one of whom is a good friend of Harry Dresden, Michael, who, got injured previously, but is actually going to be able to take up the mantle once again. There's Sasha, who is an atheist who happens to be working for God. Butters, the mortician, will actually become one of the knights of the swords as well. A sword that becomes something almost like a lightsaber. And if there's angels and knights, there's also demons. The Denarians, led by Nicodemus, who's going to play a big role in Skin Game, of course. The 30 pieces of silver that Judas received for betraying Christ, each one of them contains a demon, which can grant a person all sorts of things that they want, but it seduces them as well, possesses them, takes them over, and Nicodemus is the worst of them. So there's all of these different groups and people, at cross purposes. There's no one single bunch that are absolutely the goodies, we could say, and sometimes the bad guys are at odds with each other, and further beyond that, we have those outsiders that somebody seems to be bringing in. Now, that's a lot already, but I want to give you a little bit more world building background in two important ways that for some of you this may be just review, others this is going to be vital to understanding what's going on in these books. So the first thing that we'll begin with is I mentioned this island, Demon Watch, which is north and east of the city of Chicago, out in Lake Michigan. You can't find it on a map, whether in our world or in the fictional world, because the island itself tends to erase people's understanding and memory of it. It doesn't want to be found. We're going to find out why in a while, but it is a place of incredible power that has come up in earlier books and is going to play a vital role in these other books that we have. So Harry has established a special connection with the spirit of this island, which he's named Demon Watch. When it manifests in sort of anthropomorphic form, he calls it Jeeves. Right? And Harry has also become the warden of this island because, as it's going to turn out, we're going to talk about this a bit more, this island is actually a prison for the worst of the eldritch, scary, cosmic beings. For example, there's not one, but 6 skinwalkers in these cells, as we're going to discover. So that's one really important part of the world to talk about. The other thing, I mentioned this power vacuum that occurred after Harry's success in destroying the Red Court. So power abhors a vacuum, and in these books, something else steps into that vacuum, beginning in Ghost Story, where Harry has died. At least we think so. He's been shot. He actually set himself up for a hit from a mercenary who he knows is not going to miss. Why? Well, we'll tell you about that in just a bit. And it turns out he gets back to Chicago, and 6 months has passed, and the Fomor are now invading, and not just Chicago, but big cities all across the nation. The Red Court was vastly powerful with many agents all over the place. The Fomor are stepping in, and John Marcone and his organization, the net of sort of low to medium level magic users that Harry managed to establish with his former lover and friend before in the earlier books is under siege, we could say, and the White Council is having trouble within its own ranks, but also keeping these forces back. So the Fomor become one of the prime antagonists, particularly in Ghost Story. They're in the background more or less in Skin Game and Cold Days, but they become completely central in peace talks, because the peace talks are being held precisely to bring the Fomor into the Unseelie Accords. Things don't go entirely well with this, and I'll tell you why in a bit. But that's a lot of discussion of the narrative world involved here, probably enough so that what follows will be fairly comprehensible to you, even if you haven't read the previous Dresden File books. I think that what might be most helpful at this point, both for people who haven't read these books and those who have and appreciate them, is to run through each of these 4 novels, not going into complete detail and depth in the entire structure of the plot, but talking about some of the key points, because that tells us how the story is evolving. And I want to begin with a passage from Peace Talks relatively late in the book, when he has gone to Marcone's castle and he finds a door that is actually to part of his old apartment, the door to my sub-basement lab. And he says, I wanted to feel like I was home again. Instead, I was standing in Marcone's house. Something stirred in me down deep. It wasn't rage. It wasn't anything as ephemeral and temporary as rage. It wasn't predicated on my emotional pain. It felt older than that, primordial. What was mine had been taken away. It wasn't right, and no one was going to do anything about it unless it was me. Something went click somewhere inside. Now, here's the really important passage. Ever since the Red Court had taken my daughter, I'd been reeling from one disaster to the next, surviving. This entire situation was just one more entropy barrage hitting my life, forcing me to scramble once again, maybe getting me killed. And then in parentheses, again, technically. And he says, things were different now. I was a part of Maggie's life, and she might need me to walk her down the aisle one day. Maybe it was time I started getting ahead of this stuff. Maybe it was time to get serious. So that's going to happen a bit later. There's only a little bit of this book left, but that describes what's happening in all of these volumes. He is reeling from situation to situation, getting deeper and deeper stuck within it. And that's been going on for quite a while in the series, but the Red Court and his decision that got him actually into the conflict, or the final conflict with the Red Court to become Mab's Knight of Winter, is what has led to this. The Red Court being destroyed, the Fomor move in, Harry at the end of changes, as we're going to find out, finding a way to get out of his commitment to be the, white, or not the White Knight, the Knight of Winter, with all that goes along with that. That's what's going to lead us directly into Ghost Story. So we should talk about that. What happens at the end of Changes? Harry is shot. He is presumably killed. He falls into Lake Michigan, and in Ghost Story, we find that he is indeed a ghost, right? He winds up in a sort of police station, and he's given an option. He's told that 3 of the people you love will come to great harm unless you find your murderer. So there's, kind of a riddle set up. It's the sort of thing that Harry, as a detective, well, he's the guy on the job, and he gets sent back to Chicago to, prowl around and find out how things work. And he says, out of curiosity, what happens if I don't find the killer? And he finds out from Murphy's dad, well, you'll be trapped there, maybe forever, unable to touch, unable to speak, watching things happen in the world with no ability whatever to affect them. Hell, I said quietly, hell. So, that's what's going on there. And what we're going to find out is Harry's been gone for 6 months. The Fomor have moved in. The city is in disarray. Molly, his apprentice, took his death pretty badly and has become this rag lady who is settling scores with bad people all over the city. The White Council doesn't seem to be able to do too much of anything. We also are going to find out that Molly is being coached, trained, taught in pretty brutal ways by Harry's fairy godmother, the Leonsitta, who's putting her through her paces. And there's a lot of other stuff going on, but Harry first has to survive as a ghost and then make contact with people that he knows. So what we find out when he's actually in touch with Murphy, she says, things are bad, not so much here in Chicago. We've repulsed the worst incursions, mostly from some gang of arrogant freaks called the Fomor. The Paranet's been a huge help. It's saved literally hundreds, if not thousands, of lives. South America has had the worst of it by a long way, but every 2-bit power and second-rate organization in the supernatural world sees a chance to found an empire. Old grudges and jealousies are getting dusted off. Things are killing one another as well as mortals all over the world. When one big fish shifts its power base to South America, dozens of little fish left behind try to go big enough to fill the space. So there's fighting everywhere, right? And the White Council is itself overloaded. A bit later, we see Harry talking with Bob and with Butters Bob is now spending time with him, and they're going to tell us about these Fomor, right? So who are they? Bob says, now remember, Bob is a spirit of pure intellect. He says that the Fomor and the fairies are apparently related. Neither of them likes the touch of any metal with iron in it. Lots of interbreeding there back in the old days before the Siddha Wars. He says, even before my time, but I've heard all kinds of stories. The Dana Siddha, the Tuatha, the Fomor, the Twilig, Teg, the Shen, epic alliances, epic betrayals, epic battles, epic weddings, epic sex. And then he says, and tons of mortal simps like you used as pawns. There are no words. It was like the Lord of the Rings and all my children made a baby with the Macho Man, Randy Savage, and the Whack-A-Mole machine, right? So that's a significant problem. We're going to read a little bit later there's always going to be some sort of baddie involved in these stories. And we have the gray ghost who's doing things in town, and that's going to turn out to be one of the necromancers that Harry ran across in the past, the corpse taker, who can go from body to body. Morty, this guy who can see ghosts and interact with them, is captured by the corpse taker and being tortured by her. And what we're going to see is a daring rescue, among other things going on. There's more to the story. But we have Molly and the corpse taker actually getting into a big conflict. And so we're going to see Molly, the apprentice, stepping up as well. Molly and the Dark Wizard went into a soul gaze. There wasn't a thing I could do about it except keep trying to get closer, and they're engaged in mind magic. And we see them fighting each other over this, thing. There's a war going on for Molly's body, mind, and soul. And then finally, we're going to arrive at who did kill Harry Dresden? Well, memories are very important for ghosts. They use them in order to do things. And Harry is able to recover a very interesting memory, which is going to clarify things. So, what is it? He calls Kincaid, and Kincaid is this mercenary who's very deadly, a great sniper. Kincaid, it's Dresden. Harry, what's up? You owe me a favor for that thing with Ivy on the island. Damn right, he said. I'm calling it in. Okay, he said. You want some backup on something? I have a target for you. There was silence from the other end of the phone. Then he said, the new winter night. There's a new one? There's going to be. How do you? More silence. Then he said, it's like that. There's a good reason, I said. Yeah? There's a little girl. More silence. You'll know it's coming. No, I said, I won't. I'll see to it. So, Harry set up his own hit, as we find out, that got him killed. Now, why did he do that? Because he doesn't want to serve Mab as the Winter Knight. And we find out good reasons why in Cold Days, because as it turns out, Harry was not as dead as we think. His spirit was out of his body doing its own things over the course of the previous novel. But in Cold Days, we find that he has been on Demon Watch Island getting taken care of, and now he's going to be trained as the new Winter Knight. And that's not good. The mantle gives him a lot of power, but it also places temptations and demands on him. It wants to fight, it wants to have sex, it wants to take and take. And we also are going to learn in both Cold Days and in Skin Game especially that although it seems to give lots and lots of power, it's actually still using a human body. It just takes away the sort of restrictions on it. But tendons, bones, muscles can only take so much damage, and Harry is slowly burning himself out. Now, in cold days, we have the involvement of the Winter Court, and we've got a very interesting demand put on Harry by his owner, ruler, whatever you want to call her, Mab, the Queen of Darkness, that he is supposed to kill another fairy, the one below Mab, Maeve, the Lady of Winter. How do you kill an immortal? Well, that's a big question which they are going to pose to Bob, and he says, how can we kill an immortal? And Bob says, well, I know how to do it. And not just Maeve, but Mab, Mother Winter, any of them. And so what is it? Well, as it's going to turn out, you have to do it on Halloween. So that's leading up to the climax of this. And we're going to also learn from Bob that there's a lot of interesting stuff about magic going on in this. He is going to look at some interesting magical spaces predating wizardry as they know it. And what is actually happening there? Well, this is about a very important space on Demon Reach, the island. We're finding out what it's for. It's actually a prison. And guess who's the warden? Harry. What kind of creatures are there? The worst of the worst, cosmically speaking. Right? And so we've got all sorts of things going on. There's fights, there's quests happening, and then finally we get a really interesting confrontation between Harry and Maeve and Lily. And Maeve is actually going to say that Mab is the one who's off kilter, and Mab wants to create an Armageddon, so perhaps, it's actually Mab who needs to be killed. What we're going to, find out later on is that things are a bit more complicated. Harry is also going to, let's say, get kicked upstairs. And he's going to get to meet Mother Summer and Mother Winter, the oldest, the most powerful of them. And we are going to learn. So here's the discussion. Harry says, there are events in motion, very large events, with serious ramifications for basically the whole world. I mean, I thought the war between the White Council and Red Court was a big deal, but now it looks to me like it was more or less an opening act for the real band. Something is going to happen tonight. The Well, the prison on Demon Watch Island, will come under attack. You know what could happen if it's opened. A lot of people would get hurt in the short term, and in the long term, I'm not sure I know what would happen, but I'm almost certain it would not be good. This is when he's talking with Titania, and he needs to know whether Mab is sane. And then later, he's going to meet up with Mother Winter and Mother Summer. So they're talking about whether or not Mab and Maeve have been used by something bad, something that is taking things over. So what we're going to find out is that there's a lot going on here, and we get a reveal, let's call it, of something on a cosmic scale. So they are at the very gates of reality, and we learn that there are tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of soldiers all of them armored Sid, all of them from Winter. They all wore armor similar to mine. Out beyond the wall was a land made of dust and mud and loose shale, right? There were more bodies of troops moving out there. Some of them looked like they might have been giants or maybe trolls. Larger groups containing smaller individuals were likely Winter's gnomes. And so he says, I couldn't make out the enemy. There didn't seem to be any unity of form. They were creatures whose physiology made no sense, were utterly without order. I saw what appeared to be tentacles, enormous mandibles, claws, fangs, club-like limbs and tails. They weren't bipedal. They weren't quadrupeds. In fact, they seemed to have no regard for bilateral symmetry at all. And then he realizes what they are. Outsiders. Outsiders. Mab's fighting outsiders. And he says, I don't understand. White Council intelligence always estimated Mab's troop count at around 50,000. There are formations out there with more troops in them than that. And what do we see? She gestures. There's a pair of towers the size of the Chrysler building rising up over the wall. Between them was a pair of gates. The gates were something amazing to look at. They were huge, bigger than most Chicago apartment buildings. And we find out that the outsiders are trying to break through these gates, and they're fighting over and over and over again. The outsiders wanted in. Harry says, when did this start? Oh, Harry, Mother Summer said gently. What? Those layers and mounds of shale? They weren't shale. They were bones. Millions and millions and millions of bones. He says, what is going on here? Where are we? The edge of fairy, our outer borders. It would have taken you a decade to learn to travel out this far. And it's like this, in essence. No, she says, did you think Mab spent all her days sitting in her chair and dealing with her backstabbing courtiers? No, Sir Knight, power has purpose. What happens if they get in, the outsiders? Mother Summer's lips thinned. Everything stops. Everything. Holy crap! Does Summer have a place like this too then? Mother Summer shook her head. That was never its task. Your council's estimate was fairly close, counting only those troops protecting the hearts of Winter and Summer. Mab has more than that. She needs them for this. So Mab's troops outnumber yours by a jillion. Indeed, she could run you over at any time. She could if she were willing to forfeit reality. So he goes on, you're telling me this is why Mab has her power to protect the borders? To protect you all from the outsiders, mortal. Then why does Titania have hers? To protect all of you from Mab. So we're learning more and more about the world. Finally, the culmination, Maeve is indeed possessed by, in the grip of a corrupt entity, and we find that Maeve is going to kill the Lady of Summer. Now what happens then? The nearest possible vessel will become the Lady of Summer, the new one, as the mantle, the aura goes into her. And Maeve says to Mab, see, I've got you cornered. There's nothing you can do. You can't kill me and put my mantle into this one that you've been, grooming for that space. I tricked you. I've got it. And then Murphy kills Maeve. And then what happens? It turns out that there's somebody else who could take on that ladyship. And who's it going to be? Well, it winds up being Molly, Harry's former apprentice, who's grown up now and becomes the new Lady of Winter. And that is where we end Cold Days. After all the action in Cold Days and the revelations that we have, we move on to Skin Game, where again, Harry is the Knight of Winter using that mantle. Mab is in charge of him, and Mab is going to lend him out for a heist. Very big, daring one. that is led by one of his old arch enemies, Nicodemus, the leader of the Denarians, who we've encountered many times before. And the goal is to go through John Marcone's vault and go all the way down into the underworld to the realm of Hades. That is the Greek god. So, we know that the Norse gods are in there. Looks like Greek gods are as well. And this is going to be quite a mess. Now, there's a lot of fighting. There's a lot of puzzle solving. There's a lot of jockeying back and forth in terms of magic that's being used. Harry is not happy about what's going on. And Murphy is going to end up getting embroiled in it as well. So what we find out, this is, while one of the knights or, squires is being initiated into Nicodemus's service, Mab is there. And she says, "Shall we conclude our business? My time is valuable." And Nicodemus says, "Of course, you know why I've approached you." "Indeed. Enduriel once loaned me the services of his associate. I now repay that debt by loaning you the services of mine." "Wait, what?" I said. "This is Harry Dresden." "Excellent," Nicodemus said. He produced a business card and held it out. "Our little group will meet here at sundown." Mab reached for the card and nodded, "Done." And he, wants to resist this, but Mab says, "Well, you've got to do it." And they're going to knock over the vault of Hades, the Greek god. And we'll find out why a bit later. It turns out that Nicodemus wants a very powerful item. And a bit later, we're going to get a really interesting heart-to-heart between Harry and Michael. Harry hasn't told Michael about a lot of the things that are going on. As a matter of fact, neither has Molly, even in peace talks. That's a problem as well. So Harry is going to tell Michael, "I don't know if I'm one of the good guys anymore." And he says, "How can I be after what I've done?" Michael asks, "What have you done?" It took me another minute to answer. "You know about Mab, what I am now, the deal I made?" And Michael responds, "I also know that you did so intending to use that power to save your daughter's life." "You don't know about Susan," I said. I met his eyes. "I killed her, Michael. I don't know what I looked like, but tears suddenly stood out in his eyes." "Oh, Harry." He looked down. "She turned, didn't she? What happened?" "That son of a bitch Martin," I said. "He set her up, sold out the family that had Maggie. I think he did it to set me on a collision course with the Red King, maybe hoping to focus the White Council on the war effort a little harder. But he had inside knowledge of the Reds too. He'd worked for them, was kind of a double agent. And so we find out about the ritual. And then Michael says, "And you finished the ritual. You killed her. You killed them all." "The youngest vampire in the whole world," I said, "brand new, and they all originated from a single point, the Red King. I guess their own curse got every one of them, the whole family." And then Michael says, "Well, every Red Court vampire was a killer. Every one of them at one point chose to take someone's life to slake their thirst. That's what turned them that choice." And Harry says, "I'm not shedding tears over the Red Court. The fallout from taking them all out at once, I don't know. Maybe I wish I could have done it differently with more planning." Michael says, "Well, you don't destroy an empire built on pain and terror neatly, if history is to be any indication." And so a little bit later, Michael says, "Well, Susan sacrificed herself. She allowed me to sacrifice her." I snarled with sudden boiling fury. "There's a difference." "Yes," Michael said quietly, "there's a cost for you in that, a burden to be carried." I kissed her, I said, and then I cut her throat. And then we get this sort of redemptive moment. Michael got up and put a hand on my shoulder. "Harry," he said quietly, "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry you were faced with those awful choices. I never meant, I swallowed, never meant for all those things to happen, for Susan to get hurt, for Mab's deal to stick. I never meant to keep it. Real pain touched his eyes. I'd wondered about the after. That was me, I said. I arranged it. I thought if I was gone before Mab had a chance to change me, it would be all right. You thought, Michael took a slow breath and sat down again, you thought that if you died, it would be all right? Compared to becoming Mab's psychotic monster, compared to letting the Reds kill my daughter and grandfather, yeah, I regarded that as a win. And now I've got this thing inside me, and it pushes me, Michael, it pushes and pushes me to do things, right? There's also, we should mention another thing inside of him as well. There's a parasite that is waiting to come out. And we're going to find out what that is much later on in the story. So Mab has told him what this parasite is. And we find out Harry talking in his own head with his double about what's actually going on. So it turns out that, because he touched Laskiel's coin, there was this entity that made it from the demoness Laskiel, who's trying to seduce him into becoming a Denarian, that inhabits his head for a long time. And he says, and this is in earlier books, I gave her a name. I called her Lash. She became an independent psychic entity in her own right, and we kind of got along until there was a psychic attack, a bad one. She threw herself in the way of it. It destroyed her. My double said, yeah, but look, what she did was an act of love, and you were about as intimate with her as it gets, sharing the same mental space. I mean, it's funny you get twitchy when you start considering living with a woman, but having one literally inside your head was not an issue. And Harry says, what do you mean? And then his alter ego says, Christ, you're supposed to be the intellect here. Think. My stomach fell into some unimaginable abyss at the same time my jaw dropped open. No, I said, that isn't possible. And his double says, when a mommy and daddy love each other very much and they live together and hug and kiss and get intimate with each other, and he says, you're saying I'm pregnant? My double threw up his arms. Finally, he gets it, right? So a spiritual entity born of you and Lash when she sacrificed herself for you. It was an act of selfless love, and love is fundamentally a force of creation. It stands to reason then that an act of love is fundamentally an act of creation. You remember it, right? After she died, when you could still play the music she'd given to you, even though she was gone, you could hear the echoes of her voice. That was because part of her remained made of her and made of you. And so he throws back this blanket. This is all still happening in Harry's head. She looked like a child, maybe 12 years old in the last few weeks of true childhood before the sudden surge of hormones brought on the chain of rapid changes that lead into adolescence. Her hair was dark like mine, but her eyes a crystalline blue-green, the way lashes had often appeared. Her features were faintly familiar, and I realized in a surge of instinct her face had been constructed from those of people in my life. She had the square, balanced chin of Karen Murphy, the rounded cheeks of Ivy the Archive and Susan Rodriguez's jawline. Her nose had come from my first love, Elaine Mallory. Her hair from my first apprentice, Kim Delaney. I knew because they were my memories right there in front of me. She's a spiritual entity, I breathed. Oh my God, she's a spirit of intellect. Well, that's what happens when mortals get it on with spirits, my double confirmed. But Mab said she was a parasite. Well, lots of people make jokes, refer to fetuses like that. Mab called her a monster, said she would hurt those closest to me. She's a spirit of intellect, just like Bob, my double said, born of the spirit of a fallen freaking angel and the mind of one of the most potent wizards on the White Council. She's going to be born with knowledge and with power and be absolutely innocent of what to do with them. A lot of people would call that monstrous. So Harry now realizes, not only do I have to do this job with Nicodemus, with all these people that I don't want to be involved with, but I also have to figure out how I'm going to bring to birth this entity in my head who's going to be completely vulnerable to any sort of, suggestion or attack after she is born out of him. Now, later on, we're going to get a really interesting interaction between Dresden and the Greek god Hades. So, Hades takes him aside, so to speak, in the middle of the heist, and he's going to lead him around and explain some matters to him. So, he says, this is Dresden talking to Hades, you let Nicodemus find out about this place. Why? And then he says, this is Mab's play, isn't it? And what are they actually after? Well, Nicodemus is after spiritual weapons. And as it turns out, Hades is the one who's holding on to them. So what are they? They're weapons for the war with the outsiders. Mab wants more weapons. Why just get revenge when she can throw in a shopping trip at the same time? And then Dresden says, wait, are you telling me I'm supposed to take these things out of here? And Hades says, a much better question. My armory exists to contain weapons of terrible power when they are not needed. I collect them and keep them to prevent their power from being abused in quieter times. And then Hades says, why lock them away where anyone with enough resources can get them? And Hades says, to prevent anyone without the skill or commitment to use them well from having them. It's not my task to keep them from all mortal kind, only from the incompetents. Right? And then he says, this hasn't been a heist at all. This whole mess is an audition. And Hades says, another good question, but not the most relevant one. And Dresden says, what is the most relevant question then? And Hades says, why would I, Hades, take such a personal interest in you, Harry Dresden? And, they're going to fence around a bit. And he's going to say, I'm a guardian of an underground realm filled with terrible power, the warden of a nation prison of shades. I'm charged with protecting it, maintaining it, and seeing to it that it's used properly. I'm misunderstood by most, feared by most, hated by many. I do my duty as I think best, regardless of anyone's opinion but my own. And though my peers have neglected their charges or focused on inconsequential trivialities in the face of larger problems, it does not change that duty, even when it causes me great pain, right? And then he talks about his dog a bit, and then he says, here's why you're here. I wanted to take a moment and shake your hand and wish you luck. And that's what they do. And he says, this is Dresden, wish me luck, you aren't going to help? He says, it's not my place. I wish you good fortune and will hope that you triumph. Even if we lived in the age where my will could guide the course of destiny, it's not for the Lord of Death to take sides in this struggle. The fate of the weapons you found must be decided by those who found them, right? So we get something, really interesting happening here. And then we get sort of a final showdown. Well, before that, though, Michael, who has now come along with Harry after Karen Murphy has been terribly injured fighting Nicodemus and actually breaking one of the swords, Michael is going to make an appeal to Nicodemus. And he says, you've sacrificed your own daughter to get this. It's not too late. Do you see what happened here? What's been arranged, all the pieces that moved you to bring to the only place where your eyes might be open, where you might have a chance, perhaps your last chance, to turn aside from the path you've walked so long, a path that's caused you and those close to you and the world around you nothing but heartache and misery. And so it's offering redemption, forgiveness, peace. Nicodemus laughs at him and says, I don't dance to the Fallens tune. We may move together, but I play the music. I set the beat. For nearly 2,000 years, I have followed my path through every treacherous bend and twist, through every temptation to turn aside. And after centuries of effort and study and planning and victory, they follow my leadership. Turn away from my path. I have blazed it through the ages of humanity, through centuries of war and plague and madness and havoc and devotion. I am my path, and it is me. There is no turning aside. Dresden says Lucifer must have looked exactly like that right before things went to hell. And the battle in the end is going to have a very interesting turn. Nicodemus, it looks like he's finally winning over everybody. And Charity Carpenter, who's, a great warrior in her own right, Harry Dresden throws her the broken part of the sword of faith, Fidelicius, and what happens? It bobbles off of her fingers and winds directly in Waldo Butter's upraised hand. His fingers closed around the grip of the broken sword of faith, and if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I would scarcely believe what had happened. There was a flash of light, a sound like a howl of holy trumpets backed up by the voices of an entire choir, and suddenly a shaft of blinding silver-white light 3 feet long sprang from the broken hilt of Fidelicius and shone in the first golden light of that day's dawn, humming with the full power of the sword, only louder now, more melodic and physically audible. Nicodemus's sword was already falling, and when it met the blade of light, there was a shriek of protesting metal, a flash of sparks, and he reeled back 3 quick steps, staring at his own weapon in incomprehension. Fidelicius had sheared it off as neatly as if it had been paper instead of steel. The severed end of Nicodemus's sword glowed white hot. So Butters then attacks Nicodemus. And we find that Nicodemus has something that he hasn't had for a long time. The fury and rage and bafflement in Nicodemus's face was there, and I saw something else too. Fear. The furious light of the sword of faith renewed filled him with terror. And so that's essentially what's going to end. And Harry gets to spend some time with his daughter, who's been in the care of the Carpenters, and that's how this one concludes, with powerful weapons of faith in Mab's, control to be used for the war against the outsiders, and seemingly a lot of things resolved. Now, the much shorter peace talks is actually going to end on a cliffhanger. And what's going on in this one? Well, we've got a couple different plots happening. One is that there are going to indeed be peace talks hosted by John Marcone in his place, and it's between who? The Fomor and the Unseelie Accord signatories. So we find Ramirez, the warden, telling Harry what his job is going to be, which is to provide security and also to be there for some of the things that are going on and be a liaison to Winter. So he says the supernatural world had been kind of topsy-turvy lately. Some lunatic managed to wipe out the Red Court of Vampires completely. The resulting vacuum destabilized balances of power that were centuries old. The biggest result of that chaos was that the Fomor and undersea power hardly anyone had spoken about during my lifetime had risen up with a vengeance, taking territory from various powers and wreaking havoc on ordinary humans, mostly the poor, migrants, people without champions to stand up for them. A convocation of the Unseelie Accord signatories, Ramirez confirmed. Every major power is coming to the meeting. Apparently the Fomor requested it. They want to resolve our differences. Everyone's sending representatives. I whistled. That would be something. A gathering of influential members of the greatest powers in the supernatural world at a time when tensions were high and tempers hot. I pitied the poor town where that little dinner party was going to take place. In fact, I felt my mouth open. Wait, they're doing it here in Chicago? Ramirez said, yeah, that's why McCoy sent me to tell you, right? That's the other reason McCoy sent me. the local baron offered his hospitality. So that's the setup for this. The other big plot is that Harry's vampire White Court brother, Thomas, is going to get himself in trouble with the Svartalfs in Molly's building, because that's where Harry's currently, holed up in Molly's vast apartment. And it turns out that Thomas, for some unknown reason, attacks the Svartalfs, and they capture him and just beat the living tar out of him. And, this is happening around the same time as this peace talks council is supposed to be happening. So there's a lot of ins and outs. Harry has to figure out how to get his brother out of trouble. His grandfather doesn't know that Thomas is his brother until quite a bit later on, and in part because his grandfather hates the White Court vampires. As it turns out, his daughter had a child with one of them, and we're actually going to see Harry and Ebenezer come to blows. After first fighting against outsiders together, come to blows with each other. So we read here, I wanted to tell my grandfather about his other grandson, but I understood the hate he felt. I understood it because I felt it myself. It was the kind of hate not many people in the first world are forced to feel. The hate that comes from blood and death, from having those near you hurt and killed. That was old school hate, weapons grade, primal. And so he realizes he can't count on his grandfather to help out, but he's going to have to find other allies. And he does so, right? A Valkyrie, Lara Wraith, Molly. They manage to get him out of there. Later on, we find that he's going to connect Lara Wraith up with Christos, a rather suspicious new White Council elevated member. She gets to talk with the Svartalf king. Christos is trying to work these things out between them, and it doesn't happen. So they're going to carry out a raid and essentially bring him out. So what we're going to be seeing happening, though, is bigger than just this. It's bigger than just a peace council, because the Fomor have brought all of these signatories of the Unseelie Accords, including Mab, who's the one who organized them in the first place, arguably one of the most powerful beings in the fairy world. The Fomor are going to bring in an ally of their own, and they're looking to cause a ambush. So we have King Corb and his company of the Fomor strode into the Great Hall like they owned the place. Corb and his retinue seemed to enjoy giving everyone time to settle into an uncomfortable silence. Then he strode forward, his chain clanking, and pitched something into the air with a casual underhand toss. It was a severed head. It was Gwyn ap Nuad, king of the Twyleth Teg, one of the larger subnations of Faerie. And a gasp went through the room. The Queen of Air and Darkness lifted black eyes to King Corb. The temperature in the room plummeted, and she says, "Explain yourself." The Fomor swaggered forward a step. "A peace gift," he said, "for an old woman past her time." Mab rises slowly, and she says, "You dare. You are a guest in your house, in this house," right? And what we're going to find out is that he's brought somebody else with him. The cloaked figure moved every bit as quickly as Mab had. One moment she was 10 feet behind Corb. The next there was a sound like thunder. There was no way to track what happened clearly. I think the cloaked figure lashed out with a kick. I had the sense there were defensive energies beyond anything I could have managed around Mab, and that the kick went through them as if they had not existed. The thunder was followed almost immediately by a second sound, a roar of shattering stone. I turned my head, feeling as if I'd been encased in gelatin, and saw the pieces of the high seat flying out in a cloud. There was a ragged hole in the stone wall behind the seat about the half the size of a coffin, and the Queen of Air and Darkness was nowhere to be seen. The cloaked figure raised her hands in a very slow, deliberately dramatic gesture and peeled back her hood. The woman beneath the hood was made of bronze and crystal, and she was beautiful beyond mortal reckoning. Her hair, long and slick and close, as if she'd just emerged from water, looked like silk spun from silver. It was her eyes that bothered me, or rather her eye. One of her eyes was a crystalline emerald green. The other, on that perfect bronze face, the mutilation of her eye stood out like the gallows in a public park. The orbital ridges around the socket were covered in white granite-like scars, as if the biggest, ugliest cat you'd ever seen had scratched it out. It wasn't sunken, though the lid was closed. That mangled eye bulged ever so slightly, as though it had been meant for a being considerably larger than she was. There was around her a humming throb of energy unlike anything I'd ever sensed before, a power so ancient and terrible that the world had forgotten its like. That power demanded my respect, my obedience, my adoration, my abject terror, and suddenly I knew what was happening. I was standing in the presence of a goddess. So, who is this? She speaks, and she says, the world is gone to the children. She looks at Odin, says, One Eye, are you involved in that game still? Are you still that arrogant? Look how far you've fallen, consorting with insects as if you're barely more than mortal yourself. Marcone introduces himself, and that does not go well. She says, This is your host? You permit a mortal among you? Where is your dignity? Where is your pride? This world has gone astray. We have failed it, and I will no longer huddle fearfully in the seas and watch the mortals turn it into their filthy hive. And then she turns to the dragon who's there, Pharaohvax, and says, Introduce me to this ephemeral. So Pharaohvax says, This is Ethneu, daughter of Balor, the last Titan. And she says, This world has manifestly failed. You thought yourself wise to band together to live quietly, to embrace, her lip lifted in a sneer, civility with the mortals that used to tremble at the sound of our footsteps. I have stood by doing nothing for too much of my life. I have watched holy place after holy place fall to the mortals, forest after forest, sea after sea. They dare to walk where they were never meant to walk, and as they do, the divine retreats, withers, dies. They grow more numerous, more petty, more vicious, while they foul the world we help to create with their filth, their noise, their buildings, and their machines. This ends tonight. So she offers an opportunity to the divine. Join me while we wipe out humanity, and I will spare you. Otherwise, you are going to be undergoing what Mab has done as well. And then she engages in some magic of herself, shatters the castle's magical defenses, and knocks out power stations, electronic devices. Cars are dying, systems failed, trains went powerless. This is the city of Chicago falling into total darkness. Now, the signatories have to figure out what they're going to do. And they decide that they are indeed going to fight. So they begin to put things together. Mab came out of the hole in the wall. She was broken. Literally. Half her body had been crushed and mangled as if in some kind of industrial accident. She came through the hole in the wall with jerky, too quick motions. Once more, the queen in purple and white. Though coated with stone dust, her skin dimpled in dozens of places, as if it had been made of some kind of mostly rigid material that showed some hail damage. As I watched, there was a hideous crackling sound, and her broken shoulder snapped unnaturally in its socket and resolved in its normal pale perfection. So, quite a matter going on, there's actually a question. Will Mab bring her forces back from the outer gates? And she says, I can't. The gates are under intense attack. So what does this mean? The last Titan is in league with the outsiders. We finally have revealed to us the vast machination that has been going on through these supernatural communities and kingdoms and forces corrupting them all. The Fulmore are part of it, but this last Titan and the outsiders are part of it as well. Now, what's going to end up happening is Dresden has kind of a plan. They take Thomas and he puts him in one of the cells because that can keep Thomas alive. And that, really screws things up with Lara Wraith and the White Court vampires. But they're on Demon Reach Island. And Harry thinks, well, what if the Titan could be contained in one of the cells? So he talks with Alfred, his name for Demon Reach's sort of avatar, and he says, how big of a being can the cells contain? Physical size is not a factor, the spirit replied. Metaphysical mass is a different consideration. And he tells him, the last Titan is on the move. And Dresden says, yes, can you hold her? If you can perform the binding, I can hold her. From how far out? I am a jailer, not a bounty hunter, perhaps to the shores of the lake. If you use the Atham from the armory, and Atham is a magical tool, think magical wand, but in the form of a knife. They're powerful tools for ritual magic. I had one locked up in the island's armory. I'd stolen it from the god of the underworld, from the same shelf as the shroud and crown of thorns. If it truly was what I was pretty sure what it was, using it was going to put me in a long-term pickle. So he says, to the shore, eh? All right, get me the knife and a binding crystal and the placard. You wish 2 of the weapons? Alfred sounded slightly intimidated. That's the kind of power level we're talking about here. Sure, I said in the most cavalier fashion. After all, that's only half the arsenal. And after I leave, I want the full defensive measures of the island activated. Nothing gets in or out. Understood? Understood, Warden. And this is the end of this work, right? So he's, planning on imprisoning the Titan on Demon Reach Island. And he says, I thought of the hideous scarlet light of the eye tearing through Marcone's little fortress. This, I breathed, is too big. What do you mean? And this is Karen asking. It's too big. This isn't a war-torn nation where it can be explained away or an odd duck private investigator. It's Chicago. If Ethnio and King Corb aren't even trying to keep this quiet, the kind of blood that's going to be spilled, it will cry out. People will be terrified, Murphy said, and they'll set out to destroy what frightens them. It'll make the Spanish Inquisition look like a bouncy castle. Murphy shuddered. If Ethnio and Corb pull this off, they'll set the mortal world and the supernatural world at war. Yeah, I growled. If. And I gave the old boat all it had. So that's the cliffhanger we end on before what's going to turn into the Battle of Chicago, talked about in the next book. But it takes us through the whole plot sequence of these 4 novels, expanding the story, tying loose ends together, bringing everything to a crux. When we are fortunate enough to have a lot of reflections by an author on their own work, we may as well delve into them. And we've done that in a number of the earlier episodes on Jim Butcher and the Dresden Files. So we're going to look at some that have to do with these works, but also his creative process and a few other things, including characters in the process. And I want to begin with a little discussion from the Abstruse and Nordling interview. He's asked, where do you feel you're at with the character, Harry Dresden, at this point? Do you feel like this is a new beginning for him since after the Queen of Winter and everything? And so Jim Butcher says something really interesting here. For me personally, Changes, Ghost Story, Cold Days is the big 3-part special episode that comes in the middle of the season like they used to do in the old shows in the 70s and the 80s. This is the huge epic episode, and they occasionally preempt the whole evening to show it to you. That's what these 3 books are to me. This will be getting back to what we've done before. Harry's been in kind of isolation for a while, and the events that have happened to him have changed him over time. We get to see a bit more of that. We get to see a bit more of him stopping that. And you get back to Chicago and to the Scooby Gang and so on. He can't spend as much time with them as I'm sure a lot of readers would have, because the whole premise of Skin Game is that he gets loaned out to the evil League of Evil, as he calls it, so they can pull a job. That's what he's busy doing. He's got to hang out with all these jerks and psychopaths. So that gets us through those 3. But this idea about Changes, which we've already looked at before, and then these 2, Ghost Story and Cold Days, having to, be in a specter and then having to resume the job that he basically only did for a day as Mab's, well, maybe a little bit longer than a day, the Night of Winter, is a really interesting idea. Grimdark brings up something kind of closely related to it in one of the many interviews he's done with them. The Dresden Files has never shied away from consequences. Was there a moment in the series when Dresden's actions stopped being about winning and became more about survival? And so, again, Changes comes up. Butcher says, I'd say that's a fair description of what happened in Changes. Dresden, to that point, had been a character who would never compromise, never take the easy deal that might give him more power, but he found himself in need of it to save his daughter's life. It was at that part, he either had to change that part of himself, or he would have to live with her death as well as his own. Dresden was stubborn enough to die himself rather than compromise with the forces of darkness, but he wasn't going to let his little girl die if there was anything he could do to prevent it. The situation drove him into Mab's arms, where he is throughout all of these books, with, I guess you could say, the exception of Ghost Story, because he's sorting his own stuff out. But the changes led to his getting into what he's going to call more difficult questions, more ethical hot water than he'd been in before. And he's going to finish this little part up by saying, I don't see his problems getting simpler anytime soon. And of course, in peace talks, they are not simpler, are they? Because we're leading up to what's going to be the Battle of Chicago. Now, Mab, a major character in these stories, major antagonist of sorts. And as we find out at the end of Peace Talks, not as invulnerable as we might have thought, Dresden is actually asked about this in 2009. I'm still curious about who could hurt Mab other than Titania. Nobody comes to mind. And Butcher says, well, in terms of pure raw power, several who have appeared or been mentioned in the books could pull it off, though neither side would really win as much as continue to exist. Plus, the sudden absence of Mab would do freak and hideous things to the earth. But here, who does have the necessary horsepower to do it? Titania, though it would be a coin toss, almost literally. The mothers of Winter and Summer, who wouldn't. The White Council, as in all of the White Council, every wizard on the planet, and they would need her name. That's not happening. Dracul, who we haven't met yet. Faravox, a dragon. The Red Court, again, all the Red Court, who, by the time we're in these books, are gone. The entire White Court, very, very long odds on that, but if they actually pulled it off, whoever took Mab would effectively control her power. Cowl, earlier books as well, the Necromancer, if the Dark Hallow had succeeded. A union of the old elders of the Black Court. They were freaking scary until the Whites arranged to have them hounded down by mortals. And he concludes by saying, all of that assumes Mab is standing there alone outside a ferry, not commanding an entire nation. Literally millions and millions and millions of nightmarish creatures of every description, which she does. There's a reason that when Mab said, sign these accords and abide by them, people listened. But by the end of peace talks, we find that Mab may have met her match, right? In the Clarion interview, changing topic a little bit, you've put a lot of thought into the paranormal aspects of the world of the Dresden Files. How does the process of world building fit into the process of actually writing down prose? And so Butcher says, the world building thing is an ongoing mental process, which is why I never get anywhere on time. I spend all this time in my head wandering around places that don't actually exist and eavesdropping on conversations between people who aren't there and write it down, and that's my job. But it's one of those things I'm always taking notes on and jotting down and realizing, aha, and filling in some empty portion of the world I hadn't realized how it worked, and then I figure out, oh, this is how it works, and I write that down. The prose is the shorter and easier part. So world building is an ongoing process for him, a cumulative process, an exploratory process. And I'm going to mention another author who did something kind of similar, Ursula K. Le Guin, who we looked at the Earthsea novels many, many sessions back. And she said, well, first I made the map, and then I would imagine, what is it like going to that island or that sea? What is happening over there? And then she would figure it out. Coming back to the abstruse and Nordling interview, he's asked, well, what do you enjoy more when writing? Do you enjoy the world building or sticking with characters or the plot? Dresden says, well, my favorite stuff is probably the character stuff. I enjoy world building. I always enjoy making things that are bigger. For me, I have trouble distinguishing world building from character stuff. If you do it right, your characters and your world are breathing things. So I would have to say the character stuff, though. When I get good character moments, I feel I can perfectly represent a character. So there's something just awesome, or even if it's not awesome, something that's just fun. So let's talk about some of the characters. At the 2011 Naperville signing, he's asked, you have a big supporting cast of antagonists in the Dresden Files. Are there any that you prefer writing over others? And he says, yeah, possibly my top three favorites, at least as far as antagonists go, are Nicodemus, who is my arch bad guy. They don't come any worse than Nicodemus in my personal way of thinking in my head. He's smart, he's obsessively powerful, he's completely without any empathy or emotion at all, which makes him a really dangerous guy, or a politician, one of the two. Second is probably Lara Wraith, the head of the White Court, right? Who we encountered way, way back early on and has been playing a major role and, is involved in peace talks, among other things. And by the end of peace talks has now become an enemy again to Dresden. So what does he say? She thinks in principle it might be really nice to be a good guy, but who has time? There's lots of things for her to do, and principles are one of those things you can stop and admire occasionally if you're not busy stabbing someone in the back. Who's the third? Marcone is also a favorite. Being able to write the short story even-hand from his viewpoint was very enlightening for me because I'd never really been entirely certain what his take on Dresden was until I got inside his head and started writing him for a while. He's the guy who looks at Dresden like the guy looks at the drunken sheriff in town who's just like, I just want the shootouts to stop. It's like, come on. Yes, you keep winning them, but come on, there's got to be a better way that breaks fewer windows. At the same time, he owns the Undertaker shop. So then he shrugs and pretends like he's balancing scales. Now, coming back to Harry in the Grimdark interviews, how would you describe a hero? Is Harry a hero? Does that differ from how you view a hero as a novel reader and not the author? And he says, my writing teacher always taught us to call the central character of the novel a protagonist rather than a hero, and I've maintained that practice my whole career. Not all protagonists are heroic. Not all heroic characters are protagonists. For writing purposes, listen to this, I see them as completely unconnected roles. That said, a hero is someone who runs towards danger, who steps up in a crisis to brave risks to themselves in order to protect others. A hero is anyone who stands between the threats and predators of the world and their would-be victims and says no. A hero is someone who sacrifices their own interests to benefit those who cannot help themselves. And he doesn't end it by saying, as you would expect, well, Harry, as it turns out, is a hero. He says, my dad was a hero. A little bit more about Harry Dresden in the Abstruse and Nordling interview. He says, one thing I've noticed about Harry, he's always had problems playing the game, the political game. He's gotten a little bit sharper about that, but I heard you on YouTube at MissCon where you read some of Skin Game. He hasn't really picked up on it. Is that going to be something he figures out the hard way eventually? And Butcher says it's not something he's going to figure out the hard way. It's something he chooses to reject. He does get sharper. He does learn from his mistakes as he grows as a wizard. But I don't think he's ever going to qualify as a subtle wizard. He'd rather be sincere. But when it comes down to it, you've got to be able to pull that out of your hat against the kind of people he's dealing with. So that's one of the things he is learning. And Skin Game is going to be, in a lot of ways, it's a con. Unfortunately, when you start engaging in that kind of behavior, whether it's political, military, personal, the overflow of that is you got to start lying to people you'd rather not lie to, because that's the only way to make it work, and that's eventually going to haunt him, but he's got to start doing it at that point. In another interview with Emily Whitten, she asks, it'd be so easy to write the hero everyone wants to be or to marry or at least be friends with or whatever. Harry's a weird amalgam of a lot of issues. It would be easy to marry Sue him, give him more and more powers, but instead you've developed him. And I think that's a really important point. So I'm going to pause here on that. These books do see Harry gaining more powers and more roles. So he gains the Winter Mantle, right? Not just to fight against the Red Court and changes and ultimately destroy them, but now he works for Mab, and the Mantle of the White Knight allows him to do a lot of stuff, but it also is making things more dangerous for him, both by its tendencies to tempt him into lust and bloodletting, but also it's using up his body, right? And Butters has to say, listen, man, your body can't take all this stuff that you're doing with it. He is also the warden of the island Demon Reach, but that also comes with its own problems and powers as well, right? So coming back to this, she says, are we going to see further interesting magical developments? How do you keep that balance? And so he says, yeah, you're going to see more. The way I like to keep it balanced is, the big advantage that I have for the Dresden Files is I've always planned for there to be an end to the story. So it's not going to be endless sequels generating more and more power. Eventually Harry is a god or something like that. He says, I know what the end is going to be like and what I'm going to need him to be able to do the big stuff at the end. So I've been able to kind of scale him up appropriately as I go along. Plus, he's been scaling up into new and better villains, a higher quality of asshole for him to go up against. So that's what we've been doing all along. That makes it easy when you know what your end target is. That makes it a lot simpler to get it done that way. I'm planning on 20, maybe 21 of the case books like we've had so far, and there's going to be a big old apocalyptic trilogy at the end, and we've still got all kinds of fun stuff to do that I've been looking forward to for 15 years. It's occasionally maddening, but yeah, we've got all sorts of cool stuff ahead of us. In the Ginger Nuts of Horror interview, he's asked about the magical system again. The magical system in the files is famously flexible and often personal. How do you strike a balance between establishing rules for the reader and allowing for creative, unexpected applications of magic? He says, well, the main thing that I did was make sure that the viewpoint character, Dresden, always has more to learn, just like all of us always do. And that's very interesting because we readers, right? We are learning along with Dresden. We're always going with his sort of best guesses and understanding about how magic works rather than, well, here's the rule system, here's how it all works with one big info dump. We're getting more and more revealed to us. So he runs into things that perplex him, force him to find out more, to expand his ideas on the subject of magic, or to seek advice from those more knowledgeable or more specialized than he is. That way, there's always something coming that Dresden and therefore the audience doesn't expect. It keeps things fresh. Now, that keeping things fresh thing, he gets asked about that in Writing Excuses interview. And he's asked specifically, how do you keep the Dresden Files so fresh? How do you keep reinventing the story? And he says, to me, I don't think I am reinventing. It doesn't seem to me like I'm reinventing anything. When I do a Dresden Files story, I have a general shape of the whole thing in mind when I get started. So I plan it out. I would know, well, okay, this is what's going to happen in this part of the story. This is going to be the book about necromancers. This is going to be the one about, this thing. This is going to be the personal one where he gets an apprentice and stuff like that. So I had the plan going from the get-go. In a lot of ways, it doesn't seem like it's particularly fresh to me. I think that the real thing that keeps the books being interesting and evolving and longer is I keep trying to write the story that I'm not sure I'm skilled enough to write. When I plan the story, anytime when I sit down and get set to where I'm here, how I'm going to do the dramatic action, here's how I'm going to do the personal tensions and the stuff like that, I always try and plan the story just a little bit more than I think I can readily do so that when I'm going forward, I'm never sure I'm going to be able to get the story done the way I want to. As a result, I think that makes you keep growing as a writer. You keep trying to reach a little bit further than you've done before. As long as you can do that, you can keep improving. I think that's kind of the meta strategy that has the side effect of making the series more fresh and interesting as you go along. And a bit later he says, with the Dresden File, the basic skeleton of every story is the same. Somebody's up to something. Harry Dresden starts poking around in it, and then things go crazy. But as far as focusing specifically on areas of my writing, I don't really do that much. I kind of figure that as long as I'm trying to cover the entire range of human experience, or at least as much of it as I can, within the books that have purple-haired fairies and stuff like that, as long as I'm trying to include all that experience, it's going to force me to grow in other ways and in ways I wasn't expecting. So I'll be writing along, and occasionally I write a scene, and I'm like, man, the humor was really good in that scene. What did I do? I'll have to stop and go back and think about it. Other times I'll write along going, wow, I did not expect this to be soul-crushingly intense emotional scene, but it worked out here. Then I got to stop and figure out, well, why did it work out here? Occasionally I can't explain it. I do a lot of writing by instinct, he says. So going on to some other interesting topics to bring this to a close, he talks about foreshadowing. In the Mysterious Galaxy signing Q&A, somebody says, one of the aspects I like about your books most of all is your foreshadowing. Is there a small aspect of foreshadowing everybody's kind of missed or glossed over? And he says, yeah, there's lots of it. And I'm not going to tell you what it is, because then if I want to use it later, it'll be like, oh, cool, but if I tell you now, it'll be lame. That's what I love, too. One of my favorite series that I watched when I was learning how to write was Babylon 5. Whether you liked it or hated it, Babylon 5 was very good at taking small story elements from early in the series and sort of slowly building on them until you could realize things that were coming down the line. By the time you'd seen something the second or third time, you went, oh my gosh, that is what this means. And then it would develop a little bit later in the season. You're like, I'm so brilliant for having figured this out. It's like, no. That writer was brilliant for making you feel that way. And it was such an awesome thing to do. It was so rewarding for the long-term watchers. I always wanted to do something like that in the Dresden Files as well. So yeah, I think when you get into Cold Days, you'll see the part where I get to draw some stuff out of Stormfront that is relevant to the current story. And people who have read it are all like, whoa, that was chilling. And I'm like, well, thank you. I planned that a long time ago, and I finally got to make it work. Now, somewhat along similar lines, this is in the Grimdark interview, and this is where we're going to close. He's asked about fan theories. Has there ever been a theory proposed by a fan regarding the Dresden Files that you heard and made you think, that's not what I intended, but that's an interesting take? And he says, oh my God, fan theory is one of the most enjoyable things I get to do. I belong to a couple of Facebook groups specifically to hear fan theory. Sometimes it's hilarious, sometimes it's ridiculous, sometimes it's bang on, and sometimes it's so far off base I have trouble following the reason that got them there, but it's always entertaining. What I enjoy seeing most are the theories where the fans more or less predict what I have in mind. It tells me I'm giving them enough material to figure everything out, but no one person has really put the whole picture together. Someone has guessed at almost everything that's coming up, but nobody has assembled the whole picture yet. I think that's a good sign. Both that I'm playing fair as a storyteller and that the fans are thinking about the future so hard because they love the story and it's living in their minds. Now, what an interesting thing to say about the foreshadowing. Fan theories may catch on to that and get it and put it together, but nobody really knows until he brings all the books out. And since he hasn't written the entire sequence, looking back at some of the things he said earlier, he doesn't completely know how things are going to work out either, except in the broad outline, and that there'll be an apocalyptic trilogy capping it at the end, bringing a culmination to this saga. We've already taken up a lot of time talking about this great series, and I did want to bring up one key theme at least to close this out on. I'm not going to read excerpts from these novels in order to do that, just to keep us on track. But what I will say is, as we've seen, Dresden is a character with many responsibilities, a lot of power, and what's particularly important is the wide network of relationships that he has, some of which are, a bit conflicted with family members. For example, Ebenezer, who he's largely gotten along with, but winds up in conflict with in peace talks. Even perhaps with his half-brother Thomas, who he's leaving down in one of the cells on the island. And because of that, Lara Wraith as well. But we see him developing in a lot of really important ways. We have friendships like that with Butters, or with Michael, or with Karen Murphy, who's ultimately going to, they have been circling each other for a long time. They're going to become lovers as well, even though it winds up with her getting terribly injured in Skin Game. And, then they are able to be together in peace talks as well for a while. It's the the shortest of the novels so far, so not that long. But we've got him as a father, that is really beginning to emerge, not just in Ghost Story and in Cold Days, but especially in Skin Game. And he's even spending time with her in the apartment in Peace Talks, right? And he's got another child, too, at the end of Skin Game, the child that grew in his mind, a creature of intellect as well. And, he's got other people that he's intersecting with, connecting with in many ways. Molly, pretty important as well, who's, by the end of Cold Days, become the Lady of Winter. So she's no longer purely human anymore, but she's no longer his apprentice, but they're certainly still friends, although she's in the process of changing. And so he's trying to do the things that he's supposed to do as this hero type who plays kind of against the grain, and at the same time maintain these relationships that he has, fighting against the forces of evil, standing up for something. And there's even, him keeping himself away. He doesn't want to get too involved in his daughter's life because of worries he might screw it up, right? But then that gets sorted out. And so it takes courage on his part to navigate these relationships. He keeps himself away from his friends after he gains the mantle of Winter, and that's what we find out in Skin Game. He's also got to deal with the fallout of having arranged his own hit and the grief that his friends feel about that, especially Karen Murphy, right? As well as the consequences of other action. So we've got this really great story that's so long as it's going on, I think we're all going to be drawn into. It's huge in scope, getting huger as we go along, but not losing the thread, still as fresh and interesting and exciting as we go through these. And it's an unfinished story at this point, quite literally, not just because we haven't gotten to the end of the series that has already been written, but because some of these books are still yet to be written. Now, these are not the last ones. 2 more have come out subsequently, which we're not going to talk about. I'm not going to give you the spoilers about what's going on in those. I will say that we end on quite a cliffhanger. What's going to happen with this Titan and the Fomor who are about to attack Chicago? Will Harry succeed in confining her to a cell on the island or not? And will everything go topsy-turvy? But that you have to read the further one. So I'm going to end this here just on that note.